that really kind of mean we share our learning together. So we're right at the halfway point at 8:30, so I guess I'll start. I've got my colleagues here. Lindsay and Sarah will be joining us later. Sarah will be doing some tweeting on this, so if you feel interested in tweeting some of what we're saying or your views about what we're saying, we're at Head Heart Brain on Twitter, and we also have some links for you if you want to follow up on some of the research. So off we go. So let's start with a poll. Richard, can you pull this down for me? So we're wondering, what's your view in your company? What do you mainly use feedback for? So is it performance management, learning, teamwork to align with goals, or preparing people for new roles like in talent management? So I know you probably use it for all of them, but pick the one that's most important in your organization. Okay, so we've definitely got out ahead there by quite a long way is performance management and a little bit on learning. Really interesting, almost nothing on teamwork or on preparing people for new roles. Maybe that's being swept up in the performance management. Okay, fantastic. So some of what we're going to talk to you today is some examples of in the way people have used a kind of different feedback approach on performance management. So I think this will be quite useful to you. Like the polls, Richard, they're very interesting. I'll get rid of that now. Yeah. Okay, so one of the things I wanted to briefly talk about is what are our underlying assumptions about feedback. And I guess, you know, we assume that feedback will help people to perform better than they currently are, so to move them along the performance curve, if you like. And it's really the backbone of a number of management processes. But very rarely do you have people kind of define what they mean by feedback. And I hear people talk about it, you know, almost as a punishment. I need to give her some feedback when they want to really kind of get something off their chest and pass it on to the other person. I found this definition, which was actually from a review of feedback in a learning context, but I thought it was kind of quite useful, not least because it points out the feedback doesn't actually have to come from an individual. It can come from, you know, reading something or from our experience on the job or in life. So I don't know how that kind of definition lines up with what other people are using. But it also makes the link that it has an outcome to it. It's about improving performance. So any comments on that, please pop them in the chat box. So another poll, feedback's talked about as a good idea, but people find it hard to give. I think someone mentioned that in our chat just before we started. So let's see what you think here. How much do people in your culture actually use feedback, both positive and negative, and versus how much are they only really using it for negative? Okay, so pretty good results here that people are both using it for both, which is quite interesting. We did a survey about 3 years ago of about 3,000 employees who said only 17% said they get constructive feedback, so useful feedback, and 43% said they only ever get negative feedback or no feedback at all. So certainly for the people we've got on the line, that seems to have improved over those 3 years, or at least our perceptions of it are. So this is what people say to us about how they feel about feedback, and particularly how they feel about giving it. And I think, you know, some of the things here we know that is a problem is that it's often saved up to the end of a performance year. And in the meantime, people often feel that others don't want to hear their feedback, or they're worried about the impact of giving it, what impact that will have on their relationships. And they tend to make excuses like saying they don't have the time, even though it probably takes about 30 seconds to give that feedback. So I think one of the things we often miss is feedback can be quite hard to receive, but it also can be very hard to give, and it's that impact on how will it impact my relationship with the other person, but also will it ostracize me from the norms of the group. So we've got people saying here it's hard to give negative feedback, and that's avoided. Interestingly, on the webinar we did, on the face-to-face session we did yesterday, there were some people there who were trying to shift to much more balance and have much more positive feedback being given, and were really struggling to make that happen. And we've got Louise saying, of course, it takes time to prepare. That's right, particularly I think if there's a lot of feedback to give at one time. So James, I know you've done work on this, so you're saying you've created a feedback culture, particularly around safety. That's good. Managers are encouraged to create positive touch points, catching people doing the right thing. Fantastic. Rather than catching them doing the wrong thing. Yeah, fantastic that you've managed to get that done. Be interesting to share how you persuaded people to do that. So what's the science got to say? I think that's the interesting bit. So let me just go back a minute. So one thing I want to say is there's some stuff in here around the science that will potentially challenge your beliefs. And when we have our beliefs challenged, that can create a threat response in the brain. So if you start feeling kind of a bit irritable with what I'm saying, or angry even, and want to give me some constructive feedback, just sit with it for a while, because it could well be that that's just your brain sending you an error message saying, hold on a minute, this isn't what I expected to hear. And the thing I would say is that there will be some solutions towards the end of this presentation, both in what David's going to talk to us about and to sum up. So live with the discomfort for a while, because I think you may find some interesting things that you can do differently. Okay, so we've got someone saying it's hard to provide feedback that may upset people. Absolutely. We're doing some work at the moment with an organisation where that's quite prevalent, and one of the things we're helping them do is to reframe what we might mean by upsetting another person. So is it more upsetting to be thought as incompetent, or to understand what you need to do differently? Then we've got Deborah saying, I think half the problems with feedback, we talk about feedback being negative or positive or negative, whereas we just like to talk about it as feedback. Yeah, so yeah, my negative may be your positive. You may be very happy to hear what you could do better. So what's the evidence on feedback? Well, the most comprehensive study of feedback was carried out in the 90s, 96, I think, by two psychologists. And their findings, they were looking across a number of different studies and pulling the evidence together. And what they found was about 30% of feedback helped, but only in very specific conditions. And I'll speak about that in a minute. 30% did nothing, and about 40% reduced performance. Now, when I first read this study, I was absolutely amazed that feedback had become such a prominent part of the way we manage businesses, given how little evidence there is. You know, I'm not really sure what else we would adopt to such an extent when there was a 40% chance it would reduce feedback. So the third of percentage of the feedback that actually helped was related to a very specific task. So think about something like you're trying to use a new computer program and someone shows you how to use the toolbar, or you're kind of persistently not being able to find how to make something happen on the piece of software, and someone points you in the right direction. So that's the sort of feedback that pretty reliably helped people, and just about everything else, particularly including feedback on people's attitude, mindset, tended to reduce performance or do nothing. And we also know from research that getting praise or approval helps people to feel good and can positively impact their motivation. But at the same time, too much of that can have unintended consequences, such as making people envious because, someone's getting more attention than others. And the original research also found that what happens is people then get a dependency on continually getting that prompting and that feedback. That can create, basically costs in time and money that make it almost not worthwhile using that method. The research also says that it means that people learn in a shallow way. So when they're told how to do something, as opposed to discovering it themselves, they're less able to, apply that learning in multiple situations. So I'm going to talk about the positive stuff later, I hope this is the right version. Okay, so the other thing we know from the science, and here we're looking at neuroscience, is when I say to someone, or when you say to someone, I want to give you some feedback, it creates a threat response in the brain. And that's whether or not that feedback is positive or negative. So just those words immediately trigger that threat response. Now that's happening for two reasons. One is we tend to see threats something like 3 times more than rewards. So we're really scanning that because it's a survival mechanism. And the second thing is that we're probably primed to assume that when somebody says to us, I want to give you some feedback, they're going to give us negative feedback. Now, I'm sure there are cultures where that's not the case, but certainly most of the businesses we work in, that's the case. People's immediate assumption is that. And that negative threat response can happen in these different domains in our core model. Lindsay's popped up the link there to a short video about core if you haven't heard us talk about it before. So it impacts people's sense of certainty. Oh goodness, am I not doing what I thought was the right thing? It potentially reduces people's options by being told to work in a different way or within a process. It definitely impacts people's sense of reputation, their sense of their social standing within the group. So particularly negative feedback will make people feel that they've got less of a reputation in the group, and they may even feel shame. And then potentially it impacts people's sort of sense of equity, that they're being kind of picked on, or that the way in which they're working is not appreciated. And the issue with the threat response is it reduces functioning in what we call the executive parts of the brain, so the regions that control our creativity, goal attainment, and planning and reasoning, which are actually just the areas that you need people to be applying if you want them to actually improve their performance, or even if you want them to really understand what they're doing well. And I think those things happen whether or not we're talking about feedback in the moment. I'm noticing people here are saying that, part of the issue with feedback is it happens once a year, or we're talking about feedback, more informal touch-base type feedback, as we would call it. And then the other thing I think it's worth us thinking about, and you will have heard us talk about fixed and growth mindset before, is what are you giving feedback on? So this is Carol Dweck's work, where she's found that people tend to have one of two mindsets. So they either have a fixed mindset, which means that people assume that the gifts they were born with are they need to apply, and they can't change very much. And managers who hold this mindset about their employees will tend to feel that giving feedback is kind of not really worth the effort, mainly because people have either got it or they haven't, and there's not very much you can do to change them. Whereas people with a growth mindset believe that no matter how smart they already are, they can always get better. And people with this mindset will go out and probably seek feedback, and managers with this mindset have been shown to proactively give feedback. They're also much more likely to give coaching, to notice changes in performance, and also to give people opportunities to kind of try out new things and stretch themselves. So I think one of the things that's really worth thinking about is if you're trying to introduce more of a feedback culture, or you're trying to, shift your performance management process to be one that's more based on regular quality conversations or meaningful conversations, unless you've dealt with this issue of what's the mindset in your organization, you're likely to find it really hard to get anything to stick. And our experience is that and actually Carol Dweck's as well, is that you can relatively easily begin to shift people's mindset, both at the individual level and kind of managers collectively across the organization. So let's talk a little bit about positive feedback. This is what I skipped over earlier. So one of the things I wanted to look at is there actually any evidence that positive feedback works, or is it feedback in general that's an issue? So the research shows that praise and approval feels good and impacts motivation, but can create these unintended consequences of envy and also a kind of complacency. So it can put people into a fixed mindset. So people can think, okay, I'm okay, I've done all right, I don't need to try anymore, that sort of thing. It's also been found that, particularly with leaders, supporting a sense of their competence improves their motivation and performance. So it's not to say that this only happens to leaders, but the research was done on leaders. And then some research by Zenger found that only positive feedback helps people to keep doing what they're already doing well and to strive to do more. So it reinforces that positive growth mindset point of view. Sorry, I'm just looking here at Deborah. She's saying, I tend to see that people can give it as difficult, give the receiver the nicer message. Yeah, exactly, Deborah. So, certainly that came through yesterday, that the organisations who were at the face-to-face session found that persuading managers to give positive feedback was almost as hard, if not harder, than to get people to give negative feedback or, improvement feedback. And that is partly because of habit, because we're not used to doing it, and partly because some people hold the assumption that it will make people complacent, and I guess there is some evidence of that. And then some really interesting research about the ratio of positive to negative feedback and its impact on the performance of leadership teams. So this particular research found that 5.6 incidents of, so 6 if you like, incidents of positive to negative feedback was the combination that showed the highest performance in leadership teams. The lowest performing leadership teams had a ratio of 3 times negative feedback to 1 positive incident. But I think the interesting thing about this research is it's not saying everything has to be nicey and positive. That we can recognize that, negative feedback has its role, but it's about getting the balance right. And then a very small piece of research, but a quite interesting one, where people were actually put in a scanner and then coached, and they were either coached on kind of performance type issues, so how could you do better, which actually activated the threat response in the brain, or they were coached on the future, so what they could be and how they could achieve a positive future outcome. And when they were coached with those types of questions, those insight type questions, if you like, what they saw was that people's the rewards associated with reward and positive feelings were lit up. And then finally, one of the things we're beginning to see is clients talking about feed forward. So there's some very interesting research, which is actually hard to get, but there's a very good summary of it by Johnny Gifford at the CIPD, which took two groups of people. One had a normal performance process, and the other had what's called a feed-forward process. And the people with the feed-forward process achieved much higher performance over the period when the study was taking place. So feed-forward is based on appreciative inquiry. So it's looking at how you can get people focused, not on what they've done in the past, but what they might do in the future. And obviously that links very much to a growth mindset. So asking employees these sorts of questions: what would you do differently next time? What have you learned? How can you make the best of your strengths? Those sorts of things. The other feature of it is it's very much about employee-led, and we'll talk a little bit more about what we've done in that area. So what we're saying here from the research is feedback can work, but negative feedback probably doesn't, or improvement feedback probably doesn't. Positive feedback works, particularly if it's around specific goals. So some research done by the Prospect group looked at, people having a good day. One of the features of a good day was getting acknowledgement that they'd made progress on an important goal. We're very much fans of what we call self-feedback, so that's initiated by the employee and that they compare their own performance against the standards and will articulate how they're doing against that. So in a performance review, for example, that would be led by the employee. And that feedback requested by the employee, so, can you give me some feedback on a meeting, for example, it's been shown not to produce the same threat response as being given that feedback by someone else. And then finally, feed forward seems to produce better results. So we've got Lindsay's put some links up here to that research if people are interested. As I say, the feed forward research you actually have to pay for, but have a look at Johnny's summary. David, over to you, my dear. We're very interested in hearing about this case study. And just a couple of words about David. Well, David, you can introduce yourself. You'll explain it much better than me.
All right, thanks, Jan. I have tamed my fears and unmuted my phone, so hopefully everyone can hear me. So my name is David Perks. I'm the founder of Pay Compliment, and that's a feedback platform that has a brain-savvy principles underpinning its design. Originally, we launched that platform with a focus around in-the-moment feedback and encompassing peers and customers into that paradigm. But since that time, we've evolved to also incorporate traditional periodic feedback and also to embrace the ideas that Jan was just speaking of around enabling members, subscribers, users to request their own feedback. So now we have quite a comprehensive set of feedback principles that are embedded in a platform. we'll emphasize that the platform is there to support human-to-human conversations and to encourage those, and it's certainly not there to replace those conversations. And in fact, we've got some exciting stuff in our roadmap around remote workers and enabling better conversations around feedback for same time, different place, and different time, different place type dialogues to happen. So today, what I was going to go through is a feedback journey, an example of one of our clients. And if there's one thing to take away from my section of this, it's really that the revolution that's going on around feedback is a journey, and it's not a one-time event. And so the client that I'm going to highlight today is DFK Crosby. They're an Australian accountancy business advisory firm. They're a 55-year-old organization, so quite a bit of history embedded in their culture. And for Australian firms where tend to have a higher emphasis on small business and mid-market, they're quite a large accountancy firm at 120 people. So they had what I would describe as a traditional kind of process. They were using annual performance reviews, paper-based, linked to compensation, linked to promotion, HR-led in terms of a process, and really only involving a partner or a senior manager and a staff member. So really no formal systems around peer-to-peer customer or in-the-moment feedback. So quite a few aspects of feedback that were missing there and some missed opportunities. And our involvement started with them through a process that they were going through to reinvigorate all of their systems. And as part of that process, they were looking to automate their paper-based performance management system with a traditional HR management system or performance management system. And as we started to talk with them about that, they came to the realization that that would give them raised visibility and dashboarding and some clarity around goal alignment, but it really wouldn't do much to impact on culture and impact on engagement. And it was interesting in the poll to see that only 6% of the people in this group are using feedback to align to goals, and so that's actually a quite small element of the power of feedback, but it's really the heritage of how feedback's been used. So through conversation, the focus was switched, and it really evolved into revitalizing feedback, using it as the key tool in the performance management arena, and working at a cultural level. The feeling was that was a longer journey, but in fact it was leading to a better destination overall. So in this slide, I was really look at the stats on the right here to begin, and these are recently published stats from Deloitte, but they support a webinar that we did back in January. And in fact, they're not that helpful because what they do is they present this feedback journey as a once and done kind of process. The stats add up to 100% of organizations that are either planning to review, currently evaluating, have already reviewed, and have no plans to review. But really the state of play around this is that even organizations that have made changes have only begun their journey. They've only started to take baby steps away from tradition and towards a different paradigm. And it's no surprise to me the existing review processes date back to the 1920s when forced rankings and competency frameworks were introduced. And I'd really emphasize that this is not a once-in-100-year change, and it's an evolutionary process that organizations need to go through and that DFK are going through. rather than a one-time revolution. So in terms of DFK's evolution so far, what we'll do is we'll look at what's been done so far. We'll look at the relationship of that to the core model that Jan covered earlier and that have been topics of other HR breakfast clubs, and results to date. So that's really what we're going to cover in the next few slides. And so the current stage of evolution is a disconnection now between a structured performance review and pay. And so that's an important first step to make, and I think Matthew in the comments highlighted this earlier, that linking your performance review to your pay review is probably the best way to trigger a threat response to feedback, and certainly best avoided. So the yearly review now doesn't include ratings and has a focus on goals and development. So even though a small number of respondees were saying they were using feedback for alignment to goals, there's still a place for that. But I think it's important to understand that not all feedback needs to be tied back to goals and KPIs, and that there's a much richer conversation that can be had around individual purpose and passion, and a bigger picture than some goals and KPIs. So the structured processes have remained. What's been added, though, is regular scheduled leader feedback. And so that's been added in to the culture, but it's been left to individual teams to work out the frequency. And so where most have arrived at a monthly schedule, some are less frequent than that, and some are more frequent than that. And that choice is part of the core framework that we'll cover around how this has been done. Anytime peer and customer feedback's been added as well. So now we've got structured reviews, we've got leader-led scheduled conversations, and anytime peer and customer feedback. And so what that requires as part of the prerequisites, if you like, around that is two things. A culture that really embraces feedback to create that safe environment, but also a recognition that if you're opening this up to peer-to-peer feedback at any time and customer feedback at any time, then you can't control that environment, and you can't guarantee that it's a safe environment entirely. And so our platform has a lot of protection built into it, but the ultimate protection is the last point here, which is building everyone's feedback competency and formally improving that. And it's just important to build the competency to receive feedback well, as it is to build the competency to give feedback well. And for this kind of anytime paradigm to work, there's a need for resilience. At some point in time, everyone is going to get a piece of feedback that they might disagree with, or that they might find that they don't appreciate, and having resilience and being able to deal with that if and when it happens is an important aspect of this change. So the first three steps are really steps that can be technology assisted. The second are the last two are longer term capability developments, and we've got some smart things in our platform again that assist with those. Let's try and have a quick look at the comments. Jan, I might ask you to monitor the comments and shout out if there's anything.
Yeah, that's right. David, there's one here, someone asking if you've got any research on the impact of peer-to-peer feedback. I don't know if your systems kind of collected any data on that today.
Let's hold that thought for some of the results that we've seen, and I'll try and cover that in a second. And if I don't, then please come back and re-ask, and we'll go through that. But certainly, peer-to-peer is a very important part of our model, and the perception around peer feedback, particularly if you ask for peer feedback, is that it has much more impact than, for example, manager feedback that you didn't ask for.
Yeah.
Reduces
the threat response.
Yep. So when we talk about core, we've generally been thinking about that as the way that leaders lead individuals. But today I'm going to take a slightly different spin on that and look at core principles as a foundation for a change program and how that change program should evolve. And so let's whistle through some of this, but really the way that we've implemented the platform at DFK Crosby and the culture change that they've achieved has been part of being brain savvy and applying the core principles. So with regard to certainty, the scheduled feedback is probably the strongest element of certainty. You know as a staff member at DFK Crosby that you are going to get feedback and it's going to happen on a given date. It's also, and this is less to do with the tool and more to do with the competency development, it's also the case that that feedback is going to be affirming and feeding forward, and that it's going to be part of an evolving personal story. And so this running commentary that happens between the manager and their staff member basically is evolving to take into account changing circumstances on a regular frequency, so monthly, fortnightly, quarterly, and so forth. So there's a high degree of certainty of what's going to happen in this paradigm. In terms of options, what's been pretty interesting is this flexibility for leaders to decide with their own teams how frequent these cycles will occur. And so, that's allowed some variability across the organization, and the only one that's locked in is the structured review. Anyone can request feedback from anyone else at any time, and anyone can give feedback to anyone else at any time. And so there's lots of options around how you as an individual take control and take charge of your own feedback. And if you're not getting enough, you can address that problem. If you are feeling the need to give someone feedback, you can do that. With that, though, and particularly around in-the-moment feedback, it's very important that that feedback is actually not delivered in the moment. So the observation might occur, the feedback might be given, but if it's through the system, the recipient of the feedback needs to choose the time that they're going to consume it. And so we provide that sort of paradigm where the receiver of the feedback is really in charge of the way that they interact with the system. Now, in terms of reputation, Deborah raised, I think, that even praise can be awkward. And so and that's certainly my experience as well. And so feedback in our system is delivered privately, regardless of what it is. It isn't shared. Only the giver, the receiver, and their manager view the feedback, and the manager sees it without any kind of copying or escalation or anything. So it's just a normal part of the regime that your manager is going to be across the praise and the development observations that are coming through for you. In terms of reputation, and this is quite a hot topic, we don't embrace gamification for feedback and performance management. There's a number of research papers now that show that gamification works well in learning and development and around task-based activities, but where it doesn't work well, where it trivializes or can trivialize the authenticity of feedback is in performance management. And so we've steered away from any kind of comparison or competition to others. And in fact, the competition within the culture is with your previous personal best as opposed to with someone else's personal best.
David, can I just flag, we've got 6 minutes, so just I'm not kind of completely conscious of how much more you've got to do, but just don't want to mean you miss the end.
I'll cover that. Thanks, Jan. And then equity. A common problem with coaching conversations is that managers find them awkward and will, as a result, skip them. And of course, then they serve no purpose at all. Leaders who skip feedback in this paradigm are visible, and that's a coaching opportunity and a development opportunity for that particular leader to break that habit. In order to help with that, though, we've implemented all kinds of feedback templates, so things like 4-level feedback, stop, start, keep templates, feedback in one word, a whole bunch of structures that can be used to help foster that growth mindset that Jan talked about and really coach a leader or a peer to give feedback in a constructive way, even if it's corrective feedback. And then coming to things versus people, really the profiles separate out the person from the product, the service, or the project. And so the feedback that we're getting is on the person, and it's separate, and the conversation is separate to the progress of the project or the state of the matter. And in terms of the reward response, then it's really an intrinsic motivation that we're looking for, and we've got some social dynamic tools that will assist with that intrinsic motivation. Now,
David,
recognizing we're short on time.
Just quickly, though, because there's one important comment being made here, I think, that, a system for feedback can kind of almost dehumanize and take away the sort of quality of the human contact around feedback. Do you have any comments on that? I know you said you're doing this as a plus rather than a instead of, but any other comments?
Yeah, so one of the patterns that we've seen, which is really interesting around humanization, relates to separating the person from the product, service, or matter. And so not in the case of DFK Crosby, but in the case of the consumer feedback to fast food providers, for example. When the feedback is about the food or the restaurant or the facilities, it is generally more negatively expressed. When the food is about the person, it is almost always positively expressed. Even if it's coaching, it's constructively created as opposed to just being, a rant.
And so putting yourself in the shoes of the receiver.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a good way to look at it. And so, being able to see the recipient's face when you're using the platform and being able to have, and importantly, a conversation, so it's a two-way dialogue, really makes a computer system as human as it possibly can be. But as I said at the start, it's there to supplement face-to-face feedback and to keep a record of it as opposed to replacing that.
Yep.
So I think it was James who mentioned touch points, and that's pretty important. If we think about all of the touch points in a business, we really just scrape the surface of those touch points in terms of eliciting feedback or being open for feedback. And so, in the case of DFK Crosby, they have a mobile app. They've built the ability to give feedback into the mobile app. Everyone has their feedback profile linked to on their email signature. Yeah. If you look at give feedback to and then a staff member's name at DFK Crosby, there's a Google search result for that. And so in terms of building a culture that is embracing feedback and really saying we are, always on as far as feedback's concerned, enabling it to occur at every single touch point is very, very powerful, and DFK Crosby has seen the power of that. So I'm going to just jump into results and what we've seen, and this comes back to that comment that you were making about Carol Dweck's research. Is it has been quite quick to get new behaviors, and it's also been quite interesting to get new insights. So leaders have more productive conversations about the progress of people and not the workload. And what happens here is that you can build up a positive bank account, and by having it in the system, having an ongoing feedback stream like a Facebook wall that has all of your feedback in it, it's reinforced every day. And so it's not just a passive, piece of appreciation. It's a piece of appreciation that's really sticky. And so as you build up that bank of, positive reinforcement, encouragement, coaching, observations of improvement, that actually makes the conversation that you're going to have about a negative observation much easier to have, because it's in balance. That 5.6 to 1 ratio, it's sticky. It's not coming across that you're, being overly critical or focusing on the negative. Oops. The slides just disappeared from me. So time's up.
Richard, does that mean we're off?
No,
you've got to start.
No,
okay.
Oh, there we go.
If people need
All right, I'm nearly
to
finished.
Apologise. There will be an article covering most of this on our website. If you can stay another couple of minutes, we'll just round off.
Yeah. So, Jan, if you can have 30 seconds, I'll just talk about this one as it relates to social connectiveness, the organizational feedback network. So that's actually a new insight tool that we've been able to provide, and it shows the connectivity between people in your organization. And so this can help individuals and managers identify in-groups and out-groups and act upon those. And so a benefit of having feedback within a system is that you can then move down the HR analytics path and start to do really interesting things around organizational development and capability development and so forth. So I'll leave it at that, and if we've got any time for questions, certainly open to answering some.
Okay, David, do you want to just type your contact details into the... Oh, Lindsay's
Sure.
got them for you. Okay, so thank you, everyone. Just want to and thank you, David. I think it's a really interesting case study. So what you can do, so what are the practical takeaways? So I guess the big message is there's little point in changing performance management if you don't change your feedback approach. Shift to a growth mindset. Focus on creating new ways of working, more positive and more employee-initiated feedback. For me, that's the biggest change you can do, get more balance in your system. Reinforce new behaviors and increase social reputation will do that. And then start thinking about feeding forward. And we wanted to offer people a copy of our new book, Brain Savvy Business. So the first 10 people who email me with their postal address, I will send you a copy. Now, last time I made this offer, not even 10 people emailed me. I don't think that's because people don't want the book. I think it's because people were going, oh, there's no point. I won't be one of the first 10. So my message to you is go for it. Jan Hills at hhab.co.uk. Look forward to sending you the book. And thank you for your time today. Please give us some feedback. You can see our ID number here on Pay Compliment. And Richard, thank you for the use of the platform and for hosting this for us.
Not a problem
at all.
Have a
great day, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.